Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted that, and I give thanks to Eliza Chin for inviting me to speak about my book. She invited me, and I found out that my book wouldn't be published in advance of the meeting, so there wasn't going to be any books here. And I told Johns Hopkins University Press, I said, I need to have your books in March, not in April or May. I need to have them in. Well, they said, well, we're not sure we can do that. I said, well, then I'm not going to the meeting, and I'm not going to publicize the book. So they said, and they got a special rush printing for AMWA meeting. And it was wonderful. Everyone worked beautifully to get it here, and it's on sale here. And on this, the 101st birthday of the American Medical Women's Association. So we're going to give, for a birthday present to AMWA, all the proceeds of the book that's sold today. And at this meeting. All of them will go to AMWA. So I encourage you to buy the book, buy 2 books. You're getting a bargain at $18, but I think you should, for those of you who are not students who can afford it, pay $20 or $25 and donate to AMWA, and you can claim it on your income tax. So give it to AMWA. We need to preserve an AMWA. So there's another 100 years, so we need the donations. Thank you. I wrote the book because, this book, Adventures of a Medical Detective, because I wanted people to understand, and it's geared to a general audience, to understand what public health is, because people don't know what public health is and they don't value it. And that's why it's not supported, and our public health infrastructure is crumbling in this country. So we need for people to understand public health, and we also need more people in public health. So I hoped that this book would be exciting enough that it would lure students into public health careers. I worked at the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia for 22 years as an epidemiologist. This is also known as a medical detective. And I had a somewhat unique subspecialty, which was I was an expert in sexually transmitted diseases. And this was something very unusual at the time. And people thought people who worked in sexually transmitted diseases were perverts. And that why would you want to go and look at people's genitals? That's what people would ask me. And I would say, well, do you say that to the OBGYN, to the urologist? I'm interested in preventing and helping people with these diseases. But it was really considered not a very rewarding specialty. But it was wonderful for me. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I wrote this book about my seat experience, and you might imagine that I really didn't grow up dreaming that I wanted to be a sexually transmitted diseases physician. And I don't think my mother thought that was a good idea either, but that happened. So I'll tell you how it happened. I was finishing my residency in internal medicine, and I was going to do a fellowship in hematology oncology. That was my plan. And during my residency program, I started to have second thoughts about my career path. And I heard about it in an alumni magazine that I got. I read about this smallpox eradication program, worldwide smallpox eradication program that was being conducted throughout the world that would eliminate smallpox from the world. This would be the first time in history, that a human disease would be eliminated from the world by design of humans. And so I thought, wow, that's really great. I think I would like to be part of that. But I really didn't know what to do or how I might find out how I could be part of it. Could I join this, program? How would I do that? Well, I found out that the World Health Organization in Geneva was leading up the worldwide smallpox eradication program. Can you imagine what they did? 165 countries signed an agreement that they would all work to eliminate smallpox in the world. This is during the Cold War, and the Soviet Union signed that. And the Soviet Union donated all of the vaccine, free for that program. And they really had a great vaccine. It was actually better than the American vaccine. So it was really unbelievable that this cooperation could happen. And so I found out that every country had a liaison with the World Health Organization for this smallpox eradication program, and I found out that the organization that was the liaison in the United States was the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, which is part of the Public Health Service. And that the people who were being sent from CDC to the World Health Organization for this program were part of this sort of obscure, at that time, a part of CDC called the Epidemic Intelligence Service. Sounds sexy, doesn't it? Epidemic Intelligence Service. And this is a 2-year program where you're trained in epidemiology and biostatistics, surveillance and containment of disease, and how to investigate outbreaks. And you do this, and so I applied to CDC, and I got accepted into the class of 1974. The smallpox eradication program had been going on since the late 60s. And so we had coming to the close, almost in India, there were only 2 states left with smallpox still spreading. 2 states in India, which is an incredible conclusion that we found, that it was working so well that India had 1 billion people. In 2 states, only 2 states left. So when I got to CDC, we used to have these meetings every week of EIS officers, they called us, and then at the meetings they would make a call for volunteers. They wanted a volunteer to go to India because there's only 2 states left and we really have to get India. This is really important, we have to go to India. And so I volunteered, I was the first one to volunteer, said yes, I want to go, and I was rejected. I wasn't accepted, and I was told that the WHO wasn't accepting women into their program. And I said, I was one, there were 39 physician EIS officers, and I was the only woman. So I would be the only one excluded. So I said, well, could I please write to the head of the World Health Organization and ask him or her if they would rescind this ban of American women going to smallpox eradication program in India? But I never heard back from them. So then about a month later, another call, we have to have volunteers for India. Okay, I'll volunteer. And then they told me, well, it's not really WHO that won't take women, it's India. India's not taking women in the smallpox eradication program. So I asked to see the director of the Epidemic Intelligence Service program, and I said to him, you know, the Prime Minister of India is a woman, and I would really like to know if she knows that she's banning American physicians, American women physicians, from going to India. And I said, do you think I should write directly to Indira Gandhi, or should I write to the Indian embassy in the United States? Well, he said, I'll get back to you. And so the next week, With no explanation, I was told I'd been accepted into the smallpox eradication program. Yes. Lesson learned. Persistence is a better indicator of success than intelligence. You have to be persistent. If you really want something, you have to find ways around the barriers. That's what my learning experience was at that time. In December 1974, I left Geneva. I was there for a week, being trained how to quarantine and how to do the surveillance and containment for smallpox, how to identify smallpox. And then I was sent to one of the states in India, there was still smallpox. It's Uttar Pradesh, India. It's called UP. And I went there, and it was the most exciting professional experience I've ever had in my life. I have other experiences, but for my professional experience, this was the most exciting period of my life. I went through India. It was the northern part of India near Nepal, and it was very cold. I was expecting it to be warm. I was freezing all the time instead of sweating. And I went around, and people had never seen a foreign woman before. It was such a remote area. People would come out to see me, just to see me. And they said, "Where is she from?" They would ask my paramedical assistant, and he'd say, "Oh, she's from Lucknow," which was the capital city of UP. Because people didn't understand. There were other language. They didn't understand why I couldn't talk to them. They didn't understand. It was the most incredible experiences. And so and there was all sorts of complications. Sometimes I couldn't get across rivers to where there was smallpox, and I had trouble finding how to get across the river. Our Jeep, which we had, couldn't go over couldn't cross the river, and sometimes we couldn't get over there. We'd be waiting for days trying to get transportation. Either a camel or a boatsman would come. We were trying to get over. And so some rich man in India, in the area, found out about our predicament. And one day he came and presented me with an elephant. And he said, "I heard about what you're doing. I heard about your problems. I want you to have my elephant. The elephant swims, and he'll take you across the river." And they bring the elephant down to the river, and he's showing me, and I said, "Okay, this is fine. But I'm not sure how I take care of an elephant, So he's saying, "Oh no," he says, "it's wonderful." And he was so happy. And so we go down to the river, and the whole village is there. They're in wonder, seeing, this elephant. And we go down to the river and get on the elephant. And when you get in the water, the elephant starts swimming to the other side. And then we go all the way over the side, and it comes back to, "Oh my goodness," and say, "Yes, it's wonderful." And this is one of the stories in my book, so I won't tell you all the ending, but it was like, just think about this experience, spending 3 weeks on an elephant, going back and forth across the rivers, trying to find smallpox and eradicate it. So when I got back to, I stayed there for 4 months. That was our time, 4 months there. And I came back in April to CDC, and a month later, UP was declared free of smallpox. It was like, wow. Can you imagine being part of that? It was so exciting. It was so unbelievable. I was hooked. My career was going to be in public health. How better could you do than preventing smallpox and helping to wipe out this in the most remote parts of the world, prevent a horrible disease that we knew from centuries killed so many, blinded so many people, and scarred so many people. So eventually, smallpox was a couple of years later, it was 2 years later, the world was declared free from smallpox. The world was declared by the WHO, but there had to be a 2-year surveillance time to look for new cases, with $1,000 rewards being, thousands of dollars in rewards being asked. If you could find a case of smallpox, you would be rewarded. So there was lots of motivation to report cases, and none were, so eventually it became smallpox free. So after I finished my 2-year assignment I decided to follow and start studying viruses more. And I did an infectious diseases fellowship at the University of Utah, which had a really interesting program in virology studying herpes simplex infections. They were studying cold sores. And I have been plagued all of my life with recurring cold sores. They always came, you know, when I was going to my prom or doing something wonderful and I'd have a cold sore. And there was no treatment for it at that time. And so I decided, I had read the literature and they said that there was a possibility that ether, topical ether, treatment of cold sores, topical ether could cure herpes. And I said, I am going to do the definitive study to find the cure for my cold sores and others. So I did a double-blind placebo-controlled study with topical ether for cold sores. And to my great dismay, it did absolutely nothing for cold sores. But I did, so I went to the that year I went to the annual meeting in the Infectious Diseases Society, and I presented my report of this topical ether and its failure to kill the herpes virus or cure it. And, but at this meeting, there was a special section devoted to herpes viruses. There are lots of herpes viruses. There's herpes zoster, that causes shingles, there's herpes, there's Epstein-Barr virus, and there's genital herpes infection. And so there are many human herpes viruses. So that all of the people, there were 12 or 13 people on the panel. I was the only woman, and I was the only one that talked about oral herpes. I was talking about oral herpes is cold sores. So they asked us all to come to a press conference because there was so much interest in genital herpes at that time. They asked all the panel members to come to a press conference so there'd be a question and answer session after. So we all did. And we answered the questions, and I went home to my hotel, and I turned on the 6 o'clock news. In those days, there was no cable TV. There were 3 TV stations with the news, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And I turned on Dan Rather, CBS, and sure enough, they were covering the herpes panel, which was in Atlanta. And they were talking about all of the various things, and then I see a picture of myself on the TV screen. And it says, there's my title, there's my name and my affiliation. It said, there was a voiceover, a very nice man's voice said, Dr. Mary Guinan, expert in genital herpes infection. You can see my trouble communicating with the media here. But I had to go, I was going back to Utah, and I thought, you know, what can I do? They just misunderstood. So I go back to Utah, and I get off the plane, and I see all these TV cameras at the airport. This is before, you know, security, and and I'm looking around to see who the celebrity was that was coming in. And it turns out that the CBS affiliate in Utah had called the University of Utah and said, we want to talk to your genital herpes expert. And the university was delighted to find out that they had a genital herpes. And so they gave the press my flight number when I was arriving. And so here I am walking down, and this camera comes up to me and says, not me. And so I explained to them there was 2 newspapers and 1 TV station, and I explained very carefully to each of them. I gave 3 interviews. I explained that it was an era I was not a genital herpes infection. I was talking about oral herpes, and thank you very much. Well, the television coverage that night and the papers next day, Mary Guinan, expert in genital herpes infection. And it was, and all over Utah, people are talking about this. There's a genital herpes expert at the university. And I started getting all these calls of people. They wanted to come and see me about, genital herpes. And I said, well, I didn't answer the calls for a while because, I wasn't an expert. But they were persistent, and the dean was really angry with me because I wasn't answering. The patients were complaining that I wasn't answering their phone calls. So I gave up and said, okay. I started seeing patients with genital herpes, and most of them were young married women who had genital herpes infection and who were scared to death of getting pregnant because there was no treatment for herpes at that time, and genital herpes virus can be passed to the newborn as it passes through the birth canal, and it causes, neonatal herpes is a terrible disease. It's a infection of every organ of the body, including the brain. And the first case I saw at Utah, that child that was affected was left in a semi-comatose state for the rest of its life. So I decided this is a really important problem. We have to find out how to prevent these newborn infections and help the women. So I reviewed the literature and found out there was nothing in the literature about genital herpes in women. In fact, there was nothing about STDs in women. All the STD studies have been done on men. Who cared about the women, And women really suffer disproportionately from sexually transmitted diseases. They often can become, like for a man, gonorrhea is considered the common cold of the penis. But for a woman, it is really a horrible infection. It's usually silent, and the organisms go up the fallopian tubes, can cause pelvic inflammatory disease with lifelong pain, might have to have a hysterectomy, and causes infertility. So that's in women. Also, a woman, if they have gonorrhea, the baby is born, they can cause blindness in children. So there is something put in the eyes of all newborns to prevent blindness from gonorrhea. That's how common it was. But women had no symptoms. They didn't know they had it. And nobody was screening because they had no symptoms. The men all went to the clinics because they had symptoms. So I just thought this was a disastrous problem. So I decided to dedicate myself to studying sexually transmitted diseases in women. And I did some studies on herpes, genital herpes in women, and published them. And I was then recruited by the CDC to go back to CDC to become their genital herpes expert. In 1 year, this is in a 2-year frame, but I started in my second year at Utah. In 1 year, I became the nation's expert. And it was unbelievable. The press, everybody wanted to talk to me on television or papers, and it was really very difficult because every time I talked to the press, they would exaggerate the problems with genital herpes. They would scream and cause fear in people, who then caused hundreds of phone calls to me asking me to help them. And it'd say, the headlines would be new, it wasn't new, but it was new to the press, new herpes virus epidemic spreading, incurable. This is an incurable. And it was constantly in the media, and I was having to be with the media a great deal, and I decided I didn't want to do that anymore, actually, because I was not getting anywhere. I couldn't get any work done, so I tried to really tone down any of the press. I didn't do press interviews anymore. And then what happened was AIDS emerged. I was in there, I was the virologist in And the division that I was in, can you imagine this? I was in the division of venereal disease control. And you could see how I can empty a room if I came in and said, I'm with the venereal disease control division. So that's what people were just so shocked that a woman would do such a job. These, venereal diseases, VD, that was really a bad thing. So, but the emerging AIDS epidemic was much worse and much more serious, but the press didn't want to hear anything about it. They wanted to know about herpes infection and talk about it, whereas this emerging diseases were first found, the first in 1981, the first 5 cases of AIDS that we now know as AIDS was reported in the AMWR in 1981. And that's the MMWR is the CDC newsletter. And that, those 5 men that were reported, they had an immune suppression. They had lots of diseases that nobody could understand what they had. And one of the diseases they had was cytomegalovirus infection, which is a herpes virus. So I was Dr. Herpes then. They used to call me Dr. Herpes or maybe Dr. Condom, depending how they wanted to put me in the press. And so this was really a terrible, people were dying. People were dying. We never really had a sexually transmitted disease that people were dying from. And all of a sudden, it was a disaster. But the press didn't want to do, they wanted not to know anything about it. This was not something they didn't want to know. Why was the government bothering with these derelicts, drug users and gay people? And used to ask me, why are you working in this terrible field? Anyway, I can say that my life at CDC, I spent the rest of my career studying and working with HIV infection. And I feel that that was extremely important time in the history of AIDS in the United States, in the emerging epidemic, and what happened afterwards. And many of my stories in the book recount all of my experiences and various parts about the AIDS epidemic. So what I decided to do then was to continue studying viruses and worrying about viruses. And I'm still an expert in sexually transmitted diseases, but I left CDC. And what's happening now is that more and more viral infections are becoming sexually transmitted. We have recently found that Ebola virus is sexually transmitted, and that the men who have recovered from Ebola virus infection keep live Ebola virus in their semen for months after infection. Wow. And they don't know it, and it can be sexually transmitted. So this is extremely important. Trying to tell men who have recovered from a long infection and women not to have sex or to use condoms is very, very difficult for them to adhere to. And usually they don't have the condoms. So this was in West Africa. So now what's happening is there is a Zika virus epidemic in South America. In Brazil, the Zika virus is spread by a specific type of mosquito called the Aedes aegypti. And we have that mosquito in the United States, in the southern parts. And it's here in Florida. And we have it in other states, but it's not infected. It's not infected with the Zika virus, so it's not. So our job was to stop the epidemic from coming into the country by killing the mosquitoes, killing all the mosquitoes, and that was, and asking women in the United States not to travel to Brazil and other countries where the Zika virus is happening, because there is an epidemic of birth defects happening. There's an epidemic of birth defects related to the Zika virus, and they are horrendous. And people are telling women, don't get pregnant in Brazil, but they have no access to birth control. And this is really very difficult. Well, what's happened in the United States is we've had no spread of the Zika virus from mosquitoes. We've had more than 20 cases of sexually transmitted Zika virus infection here in the United States. And it was a man, the transmission was from man to a woman, and it was if someone who was in the affected area, in Brazil or some other country in South America, like Venezuela, where it's spreading, and in the Caribbean, and they have their loved one in the United States come back home, they have no symptoms, sometimes they have no symptoms, no signs, they have no idea they have, and they can transmit the disease to it's in their semen, and it can stay in the semen for 2 months, as long as 2 months, live, with the person not knowing they have it. Now, coincidence is the problem with this is it's the women who are going to suffer from this. And the World Health Organization and the CDC have published emergency guidelines in the past 2 weeks, how to prevent sexually transmitted Zika virus infection in the United States. And they're saying, the WHO guidelines say, we need to make sure that women have access, who don't want to get pregnant, have access to emergency birth control. Well, how do we do that? And what is emergency birth control? But the CDC guidelines says nothing about this. They say men should use condoms in case if their spouse is pregnant. Well, condoms are not a very good protection from pregnancy. But they're a good protector from the virus. But they're not in the control of women. And everyone knows that birth control practices that are in the hands of women are much more effective than those that are controlled by men. There's been numerous studies that show that. And so what we need to do, what's been happening now in our country about access to birth control, there's an epidemic of defunding of Planned Parenthood.